Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and on this episode of the podcast, we have another repeat offender, and that is Jackson Brill, and we are going to talk about the exact same thing that we talked about during the first time I brought Jackson on the podcast, and that is when to run and when to walk and what catalyzes that transition, and most importantly, for all the athletes and all the coaches that are out there listening, why it is important to train for both of these modalities very specifically, and are they in fact different skills? Jackson recently presented his master's thesis to his graduate advisors at the University of Colorado Boulder, as well as he gave that same presentation to our entire coaching department. And so I thought it was a good opportunity for us, the listeners, to take some information from Jackson's research and from his presentations and see how we can practically apply it to athletes as they are training for ultramarathon events. Jackson is a heck of an athlete in his own right. He's going to take the world by storm one day. I have no doubt about it. He is also wickedly smart, and he just happens to have this fascination between running and walking and steep mountainous events in order to maximize his own performance. So you guys watch out for Jackson in the future. So there we go. I'm going to get right out of the way. Here's my conversation with Jackson Brill.
Before we get too much into it, let's kind of set the table, right? Because I want everybody to understand how your master's defense kind of came about, because it's a little bit of a odd origin story with you kind of reanalyzing data that you already had. So why don't we just go through that first, because I think it's just a cool pivot to set the table on this.
Sure. So I originally started working in this lab as an undergraduate. So this is the locomotion lab at the University of Colorado in Boulder. So I did my undergraduate degree program in integrative physiology, worked in this lab, my last 2 years there, and we did a undergraduate thesis that was kind of the original intent of collecting this data. So that undergraduate thesis was looking at preferred transition between walking and running on uphills, and looking at a few different metrics to see if they could predict or I think a better way to say it would be trigger the preferred transition. And then the goal was, so then I ended up doing what was a 1-year addition to that program to get my MS. So CU is a cool program where if you're a good enough student, you can kind of do a 1-year add-on and pick up another degree. So I kind of got grandfathered into that program. And prior to this little sickness that took over the world called coronavirus, the goal was to do a entirely new project. So create an entirely new study, recollect data, and do the whole thing from scratch. But due to a lot of circumstances, one being COVID, I ended up just finding myself in a position where the easiest and best thing to do was to use the data I had already looked at and ask a couple more questions with regards to it. So I'm going to quickly talk about what the study that I wanted to do was, because it's really cool. We're going to have people do time trials up Green Mountain in Boulder. So that's the mountain with all the flatirons on it. And they were going to do 3 different time trials. One time trial, they're going to run the whole way. Another time trial, they were going to walk the whole way. And another time trial, they could use whichever gait, they preferred, go back and forth and whatnot. And then we were going to, have GPS data and have speed, and kind of looking at, the incline and how that changed, looking at the speed and how that changed. We thought we were going to get some cool findings with regards to, preferred transition and alternating gaits, but actually in the field. So looking at, how might rocks and roots and, just being on the side of a mountain instead of on a treadmill change some of these things. So it's still a good idea for a study. So if anybody out there wants to do that, talk to me. I'm happy to give some advice and kind of walk through that maybe in a little more detail. But ran into some roadblocks with that. It snowed a lot earlier in the year than we anticipated. This would be fall 2020, and then grad school is a lot of work, even outside of the research. So just was kind of finding myself a little stressed for time. So at the end of the day, made the decision to just look at that previous data that I collected as an undergrad.
I hope somebody does pick up that research, because I was quite intrigued by it, because anytime you do something in the field like that, it makes it all the more kind of like real and as well as practical. So let's dive into the paper. First off, I assume that at some point down the road we're going to see this pop up in an academic journal, right? You guys going to submit it?
That would be the goal, yeah. Because our sample size was pretty low, particularly for kind of the questions we ended up asking for these master's projects, right? The original goal of the study was to ask entirely different questions. We had some reasonably large p-values, not a ton, under 0.05. So we might run into roadblocks with reviewers who are still aggressively tied to that idea of p-values and needing super low ones to mean something. So we'll do our best. There's kind of two different parts to the master's thesis, as I'm assuming we'll kind of get into. So we're probably going to kind of split those up and try to publish each of them as separate articles.
Okay. So for the listeners, what I'll do is I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but it's not going to obviously go to an academic journal. It'll go to something on, my Google Drive or something like that, where they can download it, and you can, if you need to redact anything, you can redact anything from it to
I'll send you
stay compliant or whatever.
I'll send you the URL for the submitted version to
perfect.
CU. That probably works better. It's funny because when I emailed you, I was like, this is actually the final version. And then 20 minutes later, I got an email from the grad school saying, oh, table 3 was a 1/4 inch over the margin on page 37.
Oh my God.
Oh my God. So I had to go back in, do that. That'll also be the true official version, not the 99.8% finished version that you saw.
Okay, perfect. All right. That's the end of the housekeeping. Let's dig into this. Right off of the bat, you made this statement in the slide deck that I'm actually looking at right now. Humans prefer to walk at slow speeds and to run at fast speeds, which is so brilliant and simplistic to start out with. And what you're essentially exploring is what triggers the walk to run and run to walk, and what is slow, I guess, and what is fast, right? If they prefer to run at fast speeds and prefer to walk at slow speeds, how can we essentially categorize them and figure out what is the trigger from 1 to 1? So to start out with, what were essentially the questions that you were trying to answer when you were digging into this problem?
Right. So because we collected data for the preferred transition speed, so that speed that, at slower than that humans would choose to walk at, faster than humans would choose to run at. Because we kind of collected that speed for each subject, collected it on a variety of inclines, we had some cardiometabolic data and variables that we collected for similar speeds. And what that allowed us to do, once we analyzed it, is give us some evidence for, do some of these cardiorespiratory, cardiometabolic parameters, do they serve as the trigger for preferred transition? Because like you said, we're trying to ask, why do we switch at the speed that we do? So the two kind of variables in question that we looked at for my graduate work were minute ventilation or breathing rate. So the units for that would be liters per minute, or just the total volume of air that you're breathing in, over per time. And the other variable that we were looking at was the carbohydrate oxidation rate. So I think it's easier to think of that if we first think of, there's an overall energetic rate, there's an overall cost of performing exercise, performing movement, and then within that, at least for the exercise intensities we were looking at, that's made up of the amount of that energy that's provided from carbohydrates and the amount that's provided from fat. So kind of within that overall energetic cost, we were then looking at the rate of carbohydrate oxidation, the percentage of that energetic cost being provided from carbs, and wanted to see if that could serve as a trigger as well.
Okay, so you're exploring this notion of what is the trigger from running to walking and back. Sorry, yeah, walking to running and then back from running to walking. I think it's so simple, but I can't even get it straight. And you're using the bioenergetics or you're exploring the bioenergetics and seeing if there is some relationship between a certain point of that bioenergetic spectrum and this transition. Describe first, so everybody can kind of have this picture in their mind, what the research design was like. Like, how many subjects did you have? What did they actually go through? And then we'll then use that to describe all of these other different kind of inflection points that may or may not dictate this run to walk and walk to run transition.
Right. So I guess, yeah, first just getting to the subjects, they were all 10 male, high caliber, male trail and mountain runners. Because we were looking at inclines as steep as 15 degrees, that just required a really high level of exercise ability. So that's kind of why we limited it to just that pointy end of the fitness spectrum, as well as, limiting it to just males. We didn't think we'd have enough. We didn't think we'd be able to recruit enough women to make it, to kind of get enough data on that front. And so for these subjects, we first determined the preferred transition speed. And the way we did that is basically had subjects start on a treadmill at a very slow speed. So they were undoubtedly going to want to walk at that speed. And then we raised the speed of the treadmill slowly but surely until eventually the treadmill was going fast enough that then subjects were running. And we recorded that speed at which that switch occurred. And then we did the opposite. So started the treadmill fast, lowered the speed of the treadmill until eventually subjects were walking, recorded that speed. And then the average of those two, the run to walk, the walk to run, that defined their preferred transition speed. And then following that, we had subjects perform longer trials, so 5-minute trials for both walking and running. So 5-minute trial running, rest, 5-minute trial walking at 3 different speeds. So and the way we determined what those 3 speeds were was we knew that would be about their preferred transition speed. So we wanted to get basically an intersection between the running and walking values for whatever variable we were looking at. So let's just say we were looking at the breathing rate. At that slowest of the 3 speeds, we wanted to see running having a greater breathing rate than walking. And at the fastest of the 3 speeds, we wanted to see walking have the greater breathing rate. So there'd be an intersection if we think about drawing a trend line for the 3 running data points, the 3 walking data points, and that intersection could define, the speed at which optimized breathing rate, or in the case of the carbohydrate oxidation, the speed that minimized the amount of carbohydrate being used. And then we compared those kind of 2 calculated transition speeds from the cardiorespiratory data to that preferred transition speed that we calculated earlier. And we collected this data for 4 different inclines. So those 4 inclines we looked at were 0, 5, 10, and 15 degrees. And I'll give those in feet per mile as well, because maybe, especially with this American audience, maybe that's the way people best conceptualize that. Personally, that's how I conceptualize it, probably just because of Strava. It tells you how many feet, each mile climbs. So, yeah, 0 degrees. Can you guess how many feet per mile that would be, Koop? I know you're not a huge math guy, but
maybe zero feet per mile. Okay, get that one right.
Nice work.
Okay, sweet.
I'll do the rest of them. So 5 degrees was 460 feet per mile. 10 degrees was 917 feet per mile. 15 degrees was 1,367 feet per mile. So roughly,
which is steep.
Yeah, steep, super steep. Yeah, most people will be walking, that 15-degree slope anytime, they see a number like that pop up on Strava. So roughly, it's a little bit less. For every 5 degrees, it seems about a 500 feet, rise per mile, approximately.
Yeah. I mean, so when I looked at that, and I'm sure you pick those slopes deliberately. You've obviously got flat level terrain. You've got just what people would look at as a normal hill, right? I mean, it's just a normal climb. Most people would run it. Front of the Packers would run it. Back of the Packers would run it. Things like that. You've got one that's kind of an in betweeny, right? Like maybe the front of the pack people are going to run it, and the back of the pack people are going to walk it. And then you've got one grade that everybody's going to walk. Even the really good people are probably going to walk it, especially in the maybe not in the context of like a vertical K or something like that, but at least in the context of an ultra marathon, almost everybody's going to walk the last one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that 5 degree slope being 460 feet per mile, I'd say there's a lot of, mid and back the packers that would probably walk that in like 100 milers, let's say. But
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
very least, doing running intervals, pretty much everyone's going to be running that, 5 degree incline. But yeah, like you said, I'm reasonably fast. Most 10 degree inclines, especially in shorter ultras, I'm going to be running. And then, yeah, like you said, 15 degrees, nearly exclusively walking outside of, Killian and a VK.
there you go. Always got to bring up Killen. He's retired now, so maybe it's he's actually a little bit slower. But anyway, okay. So we've got this research design. What did you think was going to happen? What were the hypotheses that you were trying to either confirm or not get a confirmation on?
Right. So we were fortunate, I guess, in the sense of determined hypotheses that we had already kind of looked at some similar stuff for the undergrad research. So because it was the same data set, I went off of those findings with looking at the gait transition and kind of expecting what I would see. So I thought that that breathing rate, ventilation rate, and the carbohydrate oxidation rate, I thought those would not be triggers for the preferred transition speed. So again, if we think back to that intersection of those three speeds for walking, running, I thought that that intersection speed for the two variables would would be different speed than the preferred transition speed. And the main reason why I assumed that would happen was because for the undergrad paper, that calculated transition speed that we looked at was the energetically optimal transition speed. So just looking at overall metabolic cost, could that serve as a trigger? Which, if you were going to hypothesize that any cardiorespiratory value would be, you would think it would be energetic cost. That would be that's kind of the big one. So because that undergraduate finding was that at least across the range of all four inclines, that energetic cost wasn't a trigger for preferred transition speed. I assumed that the ventilation rate and the carbohydrate oxidation rate results would mirror that. There's a little wrinkle there when it comes to 15 degrees, but we'll get into that later.
Yeah, we'll get into that, but let's like boil that down to from a practical perspective, right? So, the hypothesis that you thought was going to the hypothesis that you thought was going to unfold essentially says that the bioenergetics don't matter in terms of when humans transition from walking to running and then back.
I wouldn't go so far as to say don't matter, but at the very least, don't serve as the primary reason for transitioning gaits at the speed that you do. Don't, you couldn't use that as the only metric you're looking at to predict preferred transition, or, it doesn't seem that that's like the number one end all be all reason why we're switching gaits. But yeah,
Yeah,
I wouldn't go
and I guess
so far to say as they don't matter.
well, okay, I guess what I'm trying to say is that humans when they're out there in the field, they typically will notice a certain speed and a certain grade for which it's easier to walk versus run. And everybody's had that experience. They're running up a climb and they look to their right and there's somebody walking, and they look to their left and there's somebody running, and everybody's going the same speed. And then you say, "Oh shit, well, I should be walking because it's easier," right? That's kind of what everybody thinks. But the hypothesis that you thought was going to unfold was essentially that, and I guess that easier part of it would indicate that there's something metabolically that's triggering the run or the walk to run transition to the run back to it's easier, right? You're saying, oh, it's easier, so I'm going to do the easier modality, right? But
Yeah,
what you're
I mean,
essentially
I
saying
wouldn't.
is that probably is not the trigger.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, bioenergetics appear not to be the trigger, or that's what we hypothesized. We'll get into results later.
Yeah.
That bioenergetics across the range of inclines aren't serving as the trigger for preferred transition. I'll push back on the easier, because to me that's getting
Yeah.
more to preferred transition speed. The reason why you're preferring it's because it's easier, or the reason why you're preferring one gait over the other is easier. But for whatever reason, or maybe I shouldn't say that, but it doesn't appear that bioenergetics are mirroring the perceived exertion like you would tend to expect.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to set up for the listeners is it's a little it appears to be a little bit more complicated than at least it does to the lay person's eye when they're looking at that. Yeah, you want to do the easier modality. There's something from the bioenergetics at play, but we could get into the actual findings right now. It turns out that not that it's not going to match that all the time.
Right. So at just kind of like we hypothesized across the four inclines, the breathing rate and the carbohydrate oxidation rate didn't appear to trigger the preferred transition speed. However, at 15 degrees, all three of those, transition speeds, if we think about optimizing breathing rate, optimizing carbohydrate oxidation rate, and the preferred, all three of those occurred very close to the same value, but only at 15 degrees.
Okay, so let's kind of get into the results, right? So why don't you walk? You're going to have to do a lot. I feel bad for you right now that I'm thinking about it, because you're going to have to verbalize a lot of figures and tables and things like that, which is always very difficult in a podcast format. But I can look at those and go, okay, I understand the results. But let's try to verbalize what the results were, and then what the actual meaning to the athletes are.
Sure. So I'm gonna just because it kind of pertains to the results we just talked about. I'm gonna start more complicated, and we're gonna go more simple. So
Okay,
maybe that's not the right order to go in general, but we're gonna try it out. So if we think about, and I guess I'll just quickly step back to the undergrad findings. So just like the master's findings, that the breathing rate, carbohydrate oxidation rate, transition speeds only were the same as the preferred transition speed at 15 degrees. That was the same for the overall energetic cost transition speed, and that was the undergraduate finding. So it was all the same data set, but what appears to be happening is that at 0, 5, and 10 degrees, at these less steep inclines, bioenergetics aren't serving as the trigger for preferred transition. There's some other variable that's likely more biomechanical or neuromuscular in nature that's triggering the preferred transition speed. So if we look at just the research for flat 0 degrees, there's some good evidence that the what's triggering the preferred transition on flat terrain is just one single small muscle, the tibialis anterior muscle at the front of the shin. So this isn't a muscle that's taking up a ton of oxygen. It's not going to have a very large influence on energetic cost, which is why likely you see a large difference between the energetically optimal and the preferred transition speed on flat terrain. But there's been, I'd say, 5 or 6 papers that have found that tibialis anterior muscle getting fatigued or getting tired at these faster walking speeds, that's what's triggering the switch to running. So likely, at least in my view, something similar is happening at 5 and 10 degrees where, again, there's not a ton of research at these moderate inclines, but likely there's something more neuromuscular, biomechanical at play that's serving as the primary trigger versus energetics. Now, if we think about the 15-degree finding, which that's kind of different than these more moderate or more gradual inclines, all of those cardiometabolic, cardiorespiratory values, there is evidence that they are serving as more of a primary trigger for preferred transition speed, because all of those calculated optimal transition speeds for energetic cost, for breathing rate, for carbohydrate oxidation rate, because those are all occurring at the same speed as the preferred transition speed, that's some evidence that those energetic values could be triggering preferred transition speed. So again, this is one finding. There hasn't been another paper looking at preferred transition on such steep inclines. So I'm kind of pumping the brakes before running too far. Alert the medias with this amazing finding. But in theory, what's going on at 15 degrees, if these results were replicated in other studies, perhaps what's happening is that as you increase the incline, the overall energetic cost increased. So humans don't need to work very hard on flat terrain, to work at their preferred transition speed, but humans have to work really freaking hard at 15 degrees to be at their preferred transition speed, which is why you see most people walking at such a steep incline, because they can't maintain a speed where it would make sense to run. They're far below their preferred transition speed. So because people are working at a very high exercise intensity, a very high level of cardiometabolic stress at that super steep incline, perhaps then because those bioenergetic variables are close to maximal, perhaps that would be a plausible theory as to why those cardiorespiratory variables are playing more of a role in gait transition. And if we boil it down simply, we could just say oxygen's at a premium, because at that 15-degree slope, you're kind of running out of oxygen to maintain that exercise intensity. All of a sudden, it makes a heck of a lot more sense to optimize, just for the sake of simplicity, oxygen. At 0 degrees, everyone can pretty much breathe through their nose at the preferred transition speed. Oxygen's nowhere near a premium.
That right there, Jackson, I think summarizes it very well, because I kind of look at it through the lens of we always like use this phrase. This just came to mind. We always use this phrase like humans are smart. We always kind of like figure out the path of least resistance and things like that. But here's an example. We're talking specifically about the preferred transition speed, and I'm emphasizing preferred intentionally. Here's an example where the cost of transport, I'm using my correct biomechanics terms here, the cost of transport is actually higher when you go to that transition than it is the other way around. So if you go from walking to running, initially at that transition speed, it's going to cost you more oxygen to go a mile than it would be if you just walked. And going back to my previous example of everybody's been in the same situation where they're, running up a climb, and they look to the left and somebody's walking, and they're looking to the right and there's somebody running. That person to the right is preferring a form of locomotion that is more oxygen intensive. It's more expensive. And it's always been fascinating to me, because this is one of those areas where economy, although it might be a small range of speed, where economy isn't the biggest driving factor, it might be, and it looks like it's likely some sort of biomechanical factor, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, at 0, 5, and 10 degrees. Got that right. I guess one thing I'll say, just because it's the second time you've brought it up with regard, I look to my left, look to my right, I'm running, they're walking. And again, this research, actually, I'll take that back. There's research on both uphill and flat terrain for this. Leg length actually predicts individual differences in preferred transition speed quite well. So the longer your legs are, the more likely it is that you will feel comfortable walking at faster speeds. Versus, the shorter your legs are, you might want to switch to running at a slower speed. So just because, so this is for all the people out there who get worried because the person next to them is doing a different gait and then they switch. I would advise that person to trust their gut, particularly if that person next to them is way taller or way shorter than them.
So you should be looking to your right at somebody the same height. This is the takeaway.
Exactly.
There.
Yeah, that would be better. That would be better at least than if they were a different height. But it's one of those things where sure, we've collected this data for the speed that people prefer to do it at, and then the speed that optimizes some of these bioenergetic values. But at the end of the day, we don't have performance data.
Right.
And is it better to switch at the preferred transition speed if your goal is to get up that hill quicker, or is it better to switch at the speed that optimizes economy, optimizes energetic cost? And it's interesting because Dr. Crom and I, my advisor, have had discussions, and my intuition is that humans, especially pretty good athletes, are pretty good at doing what's gonna just naturally do what gets them to the finish line first. So my kind of opinion is that the preferred transition speed would optimize performance, while Dr. Crom thinks that if subjects switched at the energetically optimal transition speed, so kind of changing what they naturally did to minimize their economy, his view is that that would be the correct speed to switch at to optimize performance. So that's probably another research study to do, to see, to kind of put a performance realm into this research. But yeah, at this point, we don't have any performance-oriented data for what's the correct speed to switch at.
Here's what I mean. You and I have talked about this a little bit. I actually think it's different depending upon the event duration or depending upon the task duration. So if you have a task duration, like you're going to have people go up green, right? So for a task duration like that, yeah, economy is super important, right? Because you're pinning yourself the entire climb. You're doing a climb that's, if everybody's out there, you want to do like an hour time trial or a 30-minute time trial or something like that. Running economy and locomotion economy becomes very important. And so, yeah,
oxygen's at a premium.
Oxygen is at a premium. And so the energetically preferred transition speed as a strategy to run and walk is probably the better one. But then when oxygen is not at a premium, let's just say hard rock. I got into hard rock today, right? This is at the top of my mind, just like 2 hours ago, literally before we started recording this.
Let's go. Congrats.
Yeah. Even though you're at 11 and 14,000 feet the entire time, it seems like oxygen would be at a premium, but you're going so slow, right? That's not the limiting factor for performance. There's likely more of a musculoskeletal limiting factor for performance. And then therefore switching, my opinion is, I've talked to Roger about this too, switching gaits more frequently during those long duration tasks in order to, you're essentially like spreading the neuromuscular fatigue around, because you're using everything in a slightly different pattern. That I think is the winning strategy in those situations. And so I'm presenting them as like the polar opposites because there's just like really messy middle that everybody has to deal with. But but for shorter task durations, I think the energetically optimal transition speed is the better strategy. But in the longer ones, you got to kind of like turn that on its head and just switch things around so that the biomechanics and the localized muscular fatigue is different.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad coaching strategy. Kind of like you mentioned, we're totally within the realm of theory right now because we don't have any of that performance data. So, that's why researchers exist to, provide data for stuff that coaches already know, or at the very least already think they know. I think, again, if we take this to the practical realm, I think there's a lot of plausibility to what you just said. And particularly if we think about 100-milers and stuff where, the speed is so low, there might even be an argument to, and again, I'm well within the realm of theory right now, not data.
I love how you have to couch that so often.
Well, I'd want to, because everyone, in these day and age, alternative facts, blah blah blah. I'm purely speculating right now. But like, in hard rock, there might even be an argument to only run on the downhills or flat terrain, because it's unlikely, excluding like some technicality or I'm trying to eat or whatever. You can run the downhills, you can run the flats, but maybe you'll lose a little bit of time on a couple uphills by not by walking the whole thing, let's say, and not even trying to run some of the more gradual terrains. But because you're running all those other sections, kind of like you said, spreading that fatigue around, and just kind of mixing it up and kind of providing more alteration might be more of the winning strategy. Because at the end of these super long races, it oftentimes seems that some local muscular factor is the limiting factor for going faster. So I think Yeah, basically, I think there's a lot of what you just said might be great.
Might be. We'll hold out for it. We'll see. Maybe
Need some
10 years from
data.
now when somebody does that research. Yeah, 10 or 5 or 10 years from now when somebody does that research, I'm either going to have to eat crow or I can say I called it.
Fair
Okay,
enough.
so
Yeah.
what else can athletes like practically take away from this type of research, Jackson? Like, okay, we know that these things are not the triggers for the preferred transition speed. How does that practically like play out though?
Right. So I would say at this point, just try to minimize perceived exertion when you're, climbing up the hill. With regards to gait transition. Again, there might be research in the future that says, oh no, because we know this triggers it, let's try to optimize that instead. But again, that's more speculation. So I'd say kind of the big takeaways with regards to the gait transition research. This is the part where everyone should kind of tune back in, bringing you back to planet Earth. The first kind of big picture finding is that we know well at this point that gait transition speeds slow down with incline. So whether we're looking at preferred transition or more of these bioenergetic variables, in all cases, very obviously that transition speed slows down with incline. So, for example, if we're talking about preferred transition speed or energetically optimal transition speed on flat terrain, that occurs, at about a 12 or a 13-minute mile. But if we look at 15 degrees, that speed's more of an 18.5-minute mile. So, and then for 5 and 10 degrees, it would be somewhere in there. So I think it's more on flat terrain, that transitions, preferred transition speed occurs at about 5 miles per hour. Yet as we get up towards 15 degrees, it's closer to 3 miles per hour. So what that means is that, it's not good to kind of anchor in your mind as to, what it wouldn't be smart to say at this speed is when I switch gates. At this incline is when I switch gates, because it's a function of both. So if let's say, oh, it's 14 minutes a mile for me, that might work great on one incline, but it shouldn't be the same on a different incline. Or again, let's say, oh, at 8% grade, that's when I switch. Again, it's going to depend on your speed. So just kind of adding more nuance to it. Recognize that kind of in your mind thinking, oh, I'm going to switch at a certain speed or I'm going to switch at a certain incline is not the right way to go about it. So my advice is what not to do. Again, we don't have enough to tell you what to do.
Well, a lot of ultramarathon running is I always say is success by lack of failure, right? So if you're like constantly identifying all these multiple different kind of failure points, and one of them would be I'm gonna walk whenever the speed gets whatever. I don't think that's a bad framework in a lot of in a lot of cases. Let me ask you this. I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit. So everybody has, yeah, get ready. Put your brain cap on. Everybody uses GPS, right?
Yeah.
Pretty much everybody will use a GPS watch. Your GPS watch knows or has the capability of knowing almost instantaneously the grade you're on and the speed that you're running. You can also tell your GPS watch something about you bioenergetically. You can tell it your VO2 max, you can tell it your threshold, your speed at threshold, and all those other things. How difficult would it be to program an alarm through Garmin IQ, right? Normal people can kind of do this now, through Garmin IQ, where based on a certain set of conditions for each individual, for Jackson Brill, for Jason Koop, for one of my athletes or something like that, because they all have different threshold speeds, right? For each person, you're going on this grade at this speed. I'm going to give you an alarm to tell you when your economically preferred transition speed is.
It would be really freaking hard. And I guess the simple reason as to why is because that was the goal of, the original goal of the masters of research, by having people do these time trials of Green Mountain. So the fact that I failed miserably in writing that paper and collecting that data and, maybe more importantly, writing, super complex Python code to do that for me, shows, provides evidence that it would be really hard to at this point, engineer your watch to, kind of tell you when to switch for you.
Somebody's going to do that though before the research. I guarantee you. Like there's going to be a one of the more outdoors kind of oriented watches, whether it's like the Phoenix 6 when it comes out or Koros's kind of trail version or whatever. I could see that coming down the pipeline. And I don't know what they're going to base it on, but it's kind of good to hear you say that, we need to like pump the brakes on this a little bit because we really can't put all those variables together in a formula, so to speak, and have it be all that applicable.
Yeah, it'll be like a Whoop strap where it's telling us to do stuff, but it's not really basing it off of anything valuable.
This is going to be like the
Whoop
fifth
right now,
podcast.
apparently.
Man, it is. Oh God, I recorded yesterday. This is neither here nor there. I recorded yesterday with Corinne and Marco Altini from HRV for Athletes, and we talked a lot about the Whoop strap. So the listener, that podcast will come out the week before this one, I think. So listeners can go check that one out, and then you will get the reference.
Yeah, and I'll, you're very good about not letting yourself become biased with sponsors and stuff. But if these companies come out and pay me, I'd say my price would be $5 million. I'll endorse them in full. But we have a really high price. I will sell out, but it'll be a very high number.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so what else are some practical take homes from this research? We've kind of pointed out like what not to do. Let's not pigeonhole ourselves into a particular speed and or a combination of speed and grade to determine this run to walk transition and walk to run transition. We need to trust our gut, right? And try to minimize RPE to help drive that decision back and forth. Maybe there's a consideration in longer races where you're intentionally switching up the modes between running and walking more than you would normally do so in order to kind of minimize the localized fatigue. What else can you kind of draw from the research that athletes can kind of take home and either work on in training or apply to a race?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I'll say is, if we think about that trust in your gut, minimizing RPE, that's more my theory. That would be my advice in like a coaching context. I don't think, because we don't have that evidence that says performance is optimized by the preferred transition speed, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that as a researcher. Although again, that might be my coaching advice. But yeah, I guess I think we've kind of covered a lot of the take homes, at least in my view. You might have one or two more things. I guess thinking again about the difference between the energetically optimal and preferred transition speed, and again those other bioenergetic variables kind of fall within close values to the energetically optimal transition, because those bioenergetic transition speeds occur at 0 through 10 degrees faster, at a faster speed than the preferred transition speed. You could make an argument for, at the very least, practicing and training, switching at a speed slightly quicker, at maybe 10% quicker than you naturally would. And, that if you kind of got more comfortable doing that, that would kind of bring that difference between the preferred and the bioenergetic optimization closer together. So there's perhaps an argument for doing that. But I'd say, the biggest thing to do in training is just get comfortable switching gaits. If kind of like you say as a coach, if you can do something in training, it's a lot easier to replicate in a race. So if you feel comfortable, even if it's not based on any large scientific principle, if you feel comfortable switching back and forth on a climb between running and walking and training, and you feel comfortable doing it, at the speed that you kind of find yourself doing it at, it's going to be a lot easier in a race to be confident and, not feel the need to turn to the person next to you and see which gait they're doing.
Well, and you started to bring this up, and I want to peel it apart just a little bit more. There is this concept that running and walking are skills, right? And we see this play out in the context of the competitive arena, where races that have a lot of hiking have kind of like almost different, not different winners, but you see people perform differently, I guess, as opposed to races that have a lot of like flat level terrain, right? You've got the athletes that are good on mountainous terrain. You've got the athletes that are really good on flat terrain. You had this brilliant slide in one of the parts of your presentation where it's a picture of Eliud Kipchoge and a not equal sign and a picture of Kilian Jornet. They're both fantastic athletes, and they might be very similar from a cardiovascular standpoint, right? You put them on a treadmill, and you blinded the speed, but they might be very similar in terms of their cardiac output and their VO2 max and things like that. But then you put them on the marathon race course, and they're way different. You put them on a mountainous race course, and they would be way different. So why don't you talk about that aspect a little bit, the skill aspect that kind of that really gets uncovered when we're testing people on flat level terrain and on inclines.
Sure. And yeah, no, I didn't want to interrupt you, but when you started out saying, oh, the people who do well in these steep mountainous races where there's walking are, different than when there's these more flatter or buffed out terrain. I'm like, yeah, that's the reason why I'm sponsored, because they're not all just these flat level races. Cause I would be in trouble if everything was, beautiful, buffed out, smooth, not too steep terrain. So thank goodness, I would say that the winners of these steeper races are different. But yeah, this, that was a brilliant segue kind of into the second part of my research, which was looking not at gait transition specifically, but looking at locomotor economy. So looking at running economy and looking at walking economy, and using economy as a proxy or a measurement that in part kind of is looking at this idea that these different modalities are different skills. So obviously from a performance perspective, it's maybe easier to recognize the different skills, kind of like we just said. Kilian is a great steep runner, but he's not going to win the Olympic 5K anytime soon. Likewise, Kipchoge hasn't won UTMB and likely will never in his life. Notice how I said
that's
likely,
a bold statement.
I'll put nothing past him, right? Eliud Kipchoge, nothing is impossible. But at the very least, yeah, the skills are very different, and and maybe to bring it a little closer to home. You see really good NCAA cross country and track athletes jump into the trail world, and they don't have immediate success, and some of them never have success. So for sure, I'd say it's pretty well established on the performance side of things that that the ability to succeed in these flatter races doesn't always correspond to the ability to succeed in these more mountainous races. So we measured locomotor economy, for walking, and so walking economy and running economy, and kind of use that to kind of unpiece this question and then look at this idea of skill a little bit more.
And I've always the way that I've always explained that is in the running world, and this has been particularly accentuated in the last few years with the shoe revolution and all the carbon fiber plates that are getting put in the road shoes, is that running economy is kind of the king and queen maker, in the road running world. You have athletes that are very, very similar from a VO2 max perspective. Their running economy essentially separates them from a performance perspective. You don't see that correlation as strong in trail running, meaning if you lined up the top 10 people at UTMB and you gave them all a stress test and determined what their threshold was and what their running economy at threshold is and things like that, the bubble of those numbers would be fairly large as compared to if you look at the top 10 for an international road race or something like that. So it goes back to, there's a skill component that is at play that absolutely has a big thing to do with performance.
Yeah, and you might want to link to a former podcast guest, Guillaume's paper that I think it's titled something like, how running economy isn't as big of a player in the in the ultra world, as compared to the road running world. There's a lot of variables at play, in these mountain races that kind of make any one variable, in this
Yeah.
case, locomotor economy, not kind of the kingpin. And even if we make it a little more complex, it's at the very least in the road running world, it seems like it's all about three variables at least: VO2 max, lactate threshold, and running economy. From those three variables, and we can look at Michael Joyner's paper on this. We can pretty well predict, performance from those three variables, and it's all about optimizing those three variables.
Here's the take-home lesson, though, from that, right? It's one thing to say, okay, running and walking are skill, and running economy might not be as important in trail running as is in road running. From a coach, here's the actionable piece that all the listeners can kind of take home. If you're training for a road marathon, you will absolutely want to introduce training interventions to help improve running economy specifically. Think of strength training, think of doing like bounding drills and things like that. Those interventions are very specifically aimed at improving running economy, just like the super shoes, right? Same proposition. Get a carbon fiber plate in your shoes, you're going to improve your running economy, your performance will therefore improve. There's not as compelling of an argument to do those specific running economy types of interventions in trail running, because improving running economy is not as linked, there's the caveat, is not as linked to performance from a trail perspective, particularly when I would say the trail that the athlete is competing on is very technical. So the way that I've always approached it as a coach is I'm just going to get the running economy gains through training, right? Just normal run training, normal doing intervals, we're kind of and then leave all of the other specialty interventions. I don't ever look at those as a thing to go to kind of chase around from a trail running perspective. I would rather get the 95% improvement in running economy just through the normal training process and not chase around the other stuff.
Yeah, and I'm answering this, or I'm responding now as an athlete, not as a researcher, but I feel similarly. I some of it's that I don't like to do heavy strength training or bounding drills and stuff like that, but yeah, I don't even think it's probably that helpful in the context of race performance. Considering the events that the mountain races, these ultras that are kind of my specialty, and if anything, the closest I'm kind of coming to specifically doing workouts to improve my running economy are more just pretty high intense running workouts. So VO2 max, you're just from VO2 max workouts, or let's even say you're hopping on the track and doing like hard 200s and 400s, that's, maybe even faster than VO2 max. Even from just these really high intensity running workouts, you're likely as a trail runner going to get a slight boost in running economy just because of those high force outputs and kind of the response then that maybe has on your tendons and stuff. For us slow pokes just running through the woods, that might just by doing VO2 max intervals, that might even be enough to give you a significant boost in running economy without even having to mess around with any fancy gym exercises or whatnot.
Well, I was at the running event this past weekend. It's big, huge running trade show in Austin, Texas, that happens every year for the listeners that aren't aware of it. So all the shoe companies go there, all the specialty retailers, all the device manufacturers, and things like that. And you're starting to see, one of the big themes this year was the carbon fiber plates. Everybody's kind of got them. There's even companies that will put them in insoles. And there are even companies that are now targeting the shoe manufacturers with, hey, we've got the best carbon, right? Just like they do in the cycling world. And it's starting to pop up in the trail running space as well. And you know how the shoe manufacturers work. They've got a platform and they just kind of plug and play that platform and make slight, design modifications. And I look at that and go, if you're putting a carbon fiber plate in there to improve running economy and it doesn't matter in this sport, like I kind of don't understand the purpose. And I asked a couple reps about that and they were just totally freaking clueless.
I think
If you want to have a
it's
carbon
tricky.
fiber plate in there for another reason, great, but don't do it for the running economy reason, I guess is what I was saying.
I mean, I think if we're thinking about other reasons, the carbon fiber plate's more likely to have a detriment, because Yeah, I mean, I would be absolutely terrified if I took my Alpha Flies, my Nike, Alpha Flies out on the trail. I'd probably break my ankle with, the first time I had to make a 30-degree turn in the trail. So, yeah, I'd be more worried. I'd be more worried than excited about a carbon fiber plate in a trail shoe personally, but I'm not sponsored by North Face, so it's okay for me to say that.
It's poor North Face shoes. Like I said, if you put a carbon fiber plate in a trail shoe for another reason besides running economy, great. If it's fit for purpose, great. But if you're telling me that you're putting this in there for running economy gain on the trail, I'm just going to look at you. I'm going to look at you sideways. So don't start doing that, shoe manufacturers. Okay, so we've kind of got to the part where we're looking at these different performance outcomes as not being driven by running economy in this, or not predominantly being driven by running economy. And the take home message, just to encapsulate that for the athletes, is from a training perspective, it's probably unwise to go around and chase that specific gain because it's not material to the outcome. Take the gains from the normal training process and have that be it. And I just thought of this. This is an area, Jackson, where the research and the things that you're uncovering, it has impact far outside of what you're intentionally studying. Right? Because I can look at this as a coach and I'm like, okay, that tells me what not to do. And that actually is just as good of a directional arrow in a lot of cases as what to do, because I know a lot of the right things to do. And if you're saying, okay, don't go down this path, don't go chase this direction from some, casually related research, that's great for me as a coach.
Yeah. And
I don't know if you ever intended
yeah,
it that way though.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I am an athlete and, have some coaching experience and whatnot. So I think when it comes to questions that I'm interested in looking at, certainly, I'm thinking about this within the context of exercise performance. So maybe it wasn't intentional, but at the very least, likely, doing research that's applicable to coaches and athletes is subconsciously something that I'm, probably gearing things towards. But yeah, I mean, now that we've kind of badmouthed economy, or at the very least said what it's kind of what it's not, maybe what maybe we shouldn't do with respect to locomotor economy. The reason why we collected this data and analyzed this data was more for using it as a measurement of skill. And there is going to be some limitations of that because, economy doesn't completely equal skill. If we think about skill being performance, we just talked about how particularly in ultras, economy isn't the number one driver of performance. That being said, though, we collected running economy data for all our subjects for running, all our subjects for walking at 0, 5, 10, and 15 degrees. And I'd say because we had enough data and could run enough comparisons, I think there are some useful findings with respect to, seeing how comparing running economy on flat to running economy on uphill terrain, comparing walking economy on flat to walking economy on uphill terrain, comparing running economy on flat versus walking economy on flat, or comparing running economy on uphill versus walking economy on uphill. I think I got all four kind of big comparisons. And I think the usefulness there is it tells us, so we looked at correlations and we looked to see how well locomotor economy and kind of these four different modes, flat running and walking versus steep running and walking, how well they translated from one mode to the other. Because if we found a strong correlation, that would make an argument that they're similar skills. And if we found a weak or no correlation, that would provide evidence that they aren't, that they're different skills. And from that, getting back to the coaches and athletes, if something's different skill, if we find if we find two modes didn't correlate strongly, thus meaning that that's evidence that they're different skills, then you likely should train both skills, and you couldn't utilize training to train both skills at the same time. If your races had both of those, had two different modes of it that didn't correlate.
Yeah, so you're screwed if you're not screwed, but you're not going to perform as well at Hard Rock if you spend all your time running up and down hills. You'll do okay,
Exactly.
but you'll do a lot better if you spend some of your time walking uphill.
Right. So yeah, I'll get into the results, which support what you just said. So like I said, there are kind of these four different comparisons. We can think about running on flat or gradual to running on steep, and then walking on steep versus, walking on flat and gradual, and then kind of mix and match, do all of these comparisons. So what we found was that or I guess I said that slightly differently. I'll just jump into our findings. We
Yeah,
found
just jump
that,
into it.
yeah, at for running economy, we found that at the small incline differences, so at 5-degree incline differences, so 0 versus 5 degrees, 5 versus 10 degrees, 10 versus 15 degrees, we found quite strong correlations. So in effect, that when we compared running at two different inclines, when that incline difference was only 5 degrees, small incline difference, that they were similar skills. Same findings for walking economy. The walking economy for 0 versus 5, 5 versus 10, 10 versus 15 also correlated strongly. So these small incline difference, strong correlation within the same gait. So in effect, similar skills within the same gait at the small incline differences. Now, we also looked at the economy comparisons at the larger incline differences. So think 0 versus 10 degrees, 5 versus 15 degrees, and 0 versus 15 degrees. And then we find that those strong correlations, then we find that the correlations get worse. So at those 10 and 15 degree incline differences for both, comparing running economy to itself and comparing walking economy itself, we found that those correlations weren't that good. So in one or two instances, maybe they were moderate. In a couple instances, they were, it was absolutely no obvious correlation. So yeah, it appears that once you get to a 10-degree incline difference, that all of a sudden, even within the same gait, those are different skills. So it makes sense that Kilian and Kipchoge are different athletes with a different skill set.
And could you? I'm going to ask that question later because that's going to really put you on the spot. Let's once again let's take that and move it to practically what athletes should do. So what I hear from that as a coach is that the specificity matters, right? If they are truly different skills and they're truly different skills across the different grades, and they're only correlated within within very small differences. If you have an athlete that is competing in a race that has all of these variety of grades, they're best served to do that in training as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So
which sounds so super simple, but this research actually says, yeah, you should actually be doing that.
Right. Principle of specificity. So if we think about kind of the research that's been done prior to this, that's been pretty well established for running economy. It's well known that at the smaller incline or I'd say there's good evidence at this point that, and even prior to my research, that at the small incline differences, running economy correlated strongly, but at the larger incline differences, those correlations diminished. So basically, my research filled in the gaps a little bit for walking economy, finding that the walking economy correlations parallel the running economy findings. But yeah, again, getting back to practical stuff, train with specificity with regard to steepness of incline.
Yeah. But then also just think about it if you're reconning a course, right? If you're reconning a course, you should be running and walking when you think you're going to be running and walking during the race. And we see this at the Western States camp. We see people who do soft rock, and they try to run everything. That's probably not the best way to get the most physiological adaptation and skill acquisition, since we're focusing on that word, out of that recon, because you're going to use a different skill during the race because the race duration is going to dictate that you can't run everything.
Right. And, I'm kind of outing myself right now as a frequent podcast listener of yours, but yeah, it's one of those things where in training, it's really easy to run a shit ton more than you're going to in a 100-mile race, come mile 30, 40, 50, whatever. But yeah, I would say that my findings support this idea that particularly when you're doing these longer ultras where you are going to be walking a lot more, slow down and practice walking, because those walking economy correlations are because walking economy. Well, I guess I didn't mention this earlier, but my findings for comparing running and walking economy at the same incline. So comparing running and walking economy at 0, comparing the running and walking economy at 5, comparing the two at 10, comparing them at 15, also didn't find strong correlations. They were more moderate. So comparing running and walking economy at the same incline had worse correlations than within the same gait at the small incline differences, but generally better correlations within the same gait at the larger incline differences. So comparing the two gaits at the same incline, moderate correlations, but that's not a strong correlation. So I would say, yeah, it's one of those things in training where force yourself to walk more in training, or at least if you're going to be walking more in the race, because based off of these economy findings, running and walking are different skills, with economy not translating particularly well from one to the other.
Yeah. Here's how I do it for athletes. And this research, I'm not going to say I developed this because it's somebody's probably done it way before I did. But when I have an athlete, that's training for a mountainous event, I know they're going to be hiking a lot. I try to forecast what percentage of time during the race, and this is really important. It's a percentage of time, not percentage of miles, but what percentage of time they are going to be walking during the race. And if you know the capability of the athlete, the fitness of the athlete, and you can look at the race profile, you can get that close. You're not going to like freaking dial it in, but you can get it close. If you have GPS data and you have cadence data from your watch, you can, and they've done the race before, you can get that super, super precise. Or you can look at somebody else's data that has done it before, and you can get that, and you can peel apart the cadence data that way. You can get it super precise, but you can get it close. And then what I try to have the athlete do in training is match that run and walk percentage. That's the first thing. And I almost always find that the percentage of walking or power hiking, what are we calling it now to make it not sound like everybody's going slow? Power hiking, right? That's the new word.
I don't mind sounding slow. I'm just going to keep using walking.
Okay, we're going to use walking. The amount of time that they need to bump up is double. Usually and sometimes it's triple. They're spending 10% of their time walking during training, and they need to spend 30% of it during training because that's what they're going to do in the race. I mean, it really is a 1 to 3 or sometimes even 4x. And sometimes that's hard to do because they don't have the train. But I guess my point is one of the ways that I unfold that skill component as a coach is making sure that the just simple percentage of walking is roughly matched in training as compared to what the race forecast is. And the second one, and this goes back to the specificity of the grade, is if you have a perfect situation, you try to get them on the grades that they're going to experience during the race, which is usually kind of all over the map. But to simplify it, I just say, listen, if the race has 400 feet of elevation change per mile, that's what we're going to target in training. And then that way there's enough, it kind of forces the variety, I guess is what I'm saying. You try to get enough variety in there to induce the biomechanical adaptations. What we're not doing, and we always kind of have to go back to what we're not doing as well, or this is what I don't do is say, I want to see X vertical feet this week, or why. And I get this question on Instagram a lot. How many vertical feet do I need, or whatever? I've never related it like that. I've always looked at it as, what is the rate of change compared to the rate of change during the race, because you want the biomechanical specificity. And I guess in that case, what I'm trying to say is there's no overload that's specifically associated with a number of vertical feet, like we think of a mileage overload or a volume overload. I need 10 hours per week to get an adaptation or whatever. like that doesn't exist, or I don't think it exists in the vertical world, because it's all related to the biomechanical specificity in terms of feet change per mile. That's the way I've done it as a coach. I don't know if you think about it any differently as an athlete, though.
Yeah, no, it's what I'm hearing you say is, earlier I mentioned with the gait transition stuff, so I guess throwing it back to a few minutes ago, like, oh, the gait transition is a function of both incline and speed. Don't narrow in on just using one of them as the change. So
Yeah, yeah,
what I hear you saying is, don't worry about just miles, don't worry about just vertical feet, worry about the rate of them, worry about the combination of them. Because ultimately what we're targeting is within the time we have for training, being specific with regards to the incline. Do I have that right?
yeah, 100%. Yep.
Cool. And then I guess another quick clarifying question at the beginning of what you just last said. You said, "Oh, I find 3 or 4 times is they need to walk 3 or 4 times as much." Is that referring to what they were naturally doing? So maybe
Yeah.
naturally, someone like Dylan Bowman's doing 10% walking and training, but when he's training for hard rock, maybe you need him doing more like 30 or 40%.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
cool.
And I use that, I use that 1 to 5x just to illustrate how big the discrepancy is for most athletes. And so for everybody there listening right now, like, think about that. I'm doing X race, and I'm going to, and let's just say the race is a 10-hour race, because I'm going to make the math easy for me, right? 10-hour race. And 3 out of those 10 hours, I'm going to be walking. If you're training 10 hours a week, 3 hours during that 10 hours of week training should be walking to match the race specificity. And most people, when they think about that, they're like, I don't walk at all. Or I might walk to the grocery store, or something like, that doesn't count as training at that point. But I guess my point is it's most people grossly underestimate the percentage of hiking that they are either going to be doing during the race, and or the percentage of hiking that they need to do in training. And
Yeah,
in
it's
fact, I'm going to
interesting.
ask you this.
Yeah, go
No,
ahead.
go ahead.
Okay. I
Um,
guess, yeah, it's sorry, I think there's a bit of uh, a pause, between when I talk and you hear me, whatever. It's interesting what uh, talking through this has made me realize a training error that I've done myself with regards to running and walking. So, uh, so I've kind of always agreed and understood that it's important to walk, a proportion of, ideally a similar proportion in training as you'll do in race day. So the way I've kind of done it in the past is, oh, I'm just going to perform. I'm just going to spend a couple days hiking up super steep, inclines in Boulder where I'm going to have to walk. And even though it's steeper than I'm going to be racing on, it's going to force me to walk, and, I'll get that proportion walking. This is perfect. Great. And I don't have to sacrifice, any cardiovascular fitness because of maintaining a high output because I'm on steep terrain. But what I'm realizing right now is that because, I'm hiking at a much steeper incline than I might in, let's say, a 50 miler, and because that's maybe a large enough incline difference that the walk-in economy on the steep terrain that I'm training likely won't translate to the walking economy on the more gradual terrain that I'm going to have to walk in training. So what I'm now realizing is, oh, okay, what I thought was great. Oh, I'm going to hike up Fern Canyon, and that's going to help me when I have to hike, during the quad arc 50 miler. Probably not, because those incline differences are probably more on the range of 10 degrees. So the walking economy won't correlate as well. So I probably should actually have been walking more gradual terrain, because those appear to be different skills. So
I
yeah, thanks for helping me train better.
Well,
Just for
I was
talking
going to
to you.
ask you. That's why we were stumbling all over each other, because I was going to ask you that very question. What are you going to do differently now that you know that? So you already answered that. And I will tell you, as a coach, this is not something that I would do differently, but it's definitely something that I have realized I need to emphasize more with athletes. Is this: one, walking more; two, walking and running specifically on the grades and the terrain that they're going to be experiencing during the race, just emphasizing that much more during the training process, as much as the athlete can do. I mean, some people, they just don't have access to different types of terrain. But I've kind of viewed it, I think a lot of athletes get a little over prideful with having to run every single step. You're laughing because this is probably you as well, because they don't want their intensity. They think that their intensity is going to go down, and therefore the effectiveness of the workout goes down when they switch from a run to a walk. But they need, this is really important, by the way. I think all the coaches and athletes that are listening to this need to take this into consideration. The more effective the more effective training activity or training run is going to be the one that is the most biomechanically specific in this versus the one that's the most intense. So let's just say that you're doing a normal training run, right? And you need to walk more, right? Walking more at a lower intensity is a good trade-off versus running more at a higher intensity. And most people's psychology is reversed, right? Because they're so intensity focused, and they think that the higher intensity is going to elicit a superior adaptation. But the way that I look at it is, it doesn't matter during an endurance run if you're at like 60% of your VO2 max, or you slow down to a walk and locomote at 50% of your VO2 max. The adaptation between those two intensities is virtually identical. So since the cardiovascular adaptation between those intensities are virtually identical, I would rather take the advantage of getting the biomechanical specificity along the way. And plus, then it's easier. So you can do more volume, you can recover faster and stuff like that. And I guarantee you, there are a ton of athletes and coaches out there that don't really think about that. They think about going a little bit harder on the climbs in order to maintain a run. And they think that that is more effective because of the increase in intensity. And there might be cases where, yeah, if you're not doing any intensity, that might be the more effective workout. But as long as you have other organized intensity outside of that, slow down to a walk, you get the biomechanical specificity, and the cardiovascular implications are almost identical between those two intensities.
Right. Yeah. Maybe a succinct way to say it is, you lose 1%, in terms of, a cardiovascular stimulus for the sake of a 10 to 25% increase in, specificity and, the performance implications of that.
Yep. Bingo. Yeah, nail on the head right there. All right, man, we're going to let you go. We already went through all the things that we wouldn't do and that we're going to do differently. Links to everything will be on the show notes. Jackson, do you want people to reach out to you and heckle you on social media? You can give your handles now.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I actively use Strava and Instagram, so happy to see people over there.
And what's your Instagram handle?
My name, maybe there's a dot in between the first and the last name. I'm not sure.
All right. I'll link it up in the show notes, man. Thanks for coming on the podcast today, man. Thanks for doing the research. Like I said, links to the show notes there'll be links in the show notes to everything that we talked about, man. This was fun.
Yeah, no, it's doing the research. Sometimes, it can get a little lonely in there. So when I have a chance to kind of present, whether it's, at a research conference or even just more informally on something like this, it's kind of makes it all worth it in a way. So yeah, I appreciate you giving me this platform.
All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Jackson for coming on the podcast today. There will be links in the show notes to Jackson's presentation. I hope everybody goes and checks those out and geeks out a little bit further. And I also hope everybody takes to heart this extremely important concept that running and walking are fundamentally different, and that we need to train for them as specific modalities when we're thinking about training for particularly mountainous, trail, and ultramarathon types of events. In fact, this is one of the areas that I have changed in my coaching the most since first working with ultra runners, and that is to emphasize walking and power hiking more throughout the training process than I did when I first started working with trail and ultra runners. Thank you to all the listeners that are out there. If you had feedback for this particular episode, you can hit me up on social media. I always appreciate those comments. You can share this podcast with your friends and training partners, and you can give it a rating on Apple Podcasts. That really helps the podcast out a lot. I appreciate the heck out of each and every one of the listeners out there. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.